Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the exceptional event of the Learned Society, the Palacký lecture. Every 2 years we have opportunity to hear outstanding scholars in social sciences and humanities, world-renowned thinkers dealing with important issues of past and present. Not always the most visible, but therefore important. For this year, we invited Stein Ringen, who will tell us about the role that religion played in modernization of Scandinavia. Welcome here, Stein. Let me say a few words about our speaker. Stein is a sociologist, professor of the Oxford University, with quite wide field of interest. He worked in state administration, taught sociology and social policy in several countries, being familiar with empirical analysis of sociological data, as well as comparative analysis of social policy systems. Later, he began to focus on political systems and quality of democracy in various countries, including both the supposed pillar of democracy like the US and the UK, and authoritarian regimes like China. In many cases, he found that the quality of democracy is poor, and we can hear his books, we can read his books Nation of Devils and The Perfect Dictatorship translated into Czech. I hope other books will follow. In previous years, Stein turned his attention to history and wrote a fresh, sociologically educated interpretation of Scandinavian history, and today we will hear a small part of this fascinating interpretation. But before I pass the floor to him, I would like to say one more thing. Czech translations of Stein's books are not the only connection he has with this country. He was in Prague first time in the early 80s, escaping due to political reasons, but did not resent us. 10 years later, he was among those scholars who tried to establish Central European University here in Prague, and he established close personal and academic relations to many Czech sociologists. I am happy that some of them are here today. The only sad thing is that one of them, Ivo Možný, a member of our society, is no more among us. But the rest of us have today a unique opportunity to hear Stein, and so I'm passing the floor to a more educated and brilliant speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stein, for your very generous welcome and introduction. And thank you for this invitation to speak here to the Learned Society of the Czech Republic. The story of Scandinavia is an ultra-dramatic case of European modernization. The Scandinavians were latecomers. As civilization washed north and west across the continent, Scandinavia was at the end of the road. Population came late, The knowledge of agriculture came late, and Christianity came late. When Charlemagne was emperor of Europe, we are around the year 800, there was perhaps a kingship of sorts in Denmark, but none yet in either Norway or Sweden, and the Danish one soon collapsed. The cleric Alcuin, Charlemagne's favorite scholar, wrote of an early missionary that he visited the wild Danish tribes. The Nordics who presented themselves to the Europeans as Vikings were pagans and proud of it. The early Danish king, one Gudfred, boasted that he would march on Aachen, dethrone Charles, chase the Franks back across the Rhine, and stamp out their Christianity. Of course, that came to nothing. While Charles governed his domain with the help of an apparatus of churches and monasteries and a constant flow of documents, accounts, lists, letters, and written orders, Gudfred knew of no other instrument of rule than the sword. He would not even have known that his own domain was small and that of Charles large. There are 164 surviving charters issued by Charlemagne and many other documents. The earliest known Scandinavian royal charter and written document is one issued in 1085, more than 150 years after Charlemagne's death. Until they adopted Christianity, by around the year 1000, the Scandinavians did not have knowledge of writing except for the scratching of little runic messages. The technology of pen and ink came with imported clerics, and for the next 3 centuries, writing was exclusively in the hands of churchmen. The Vikings were ruthless invaders across Europe, but it says much about who they were that no one took any interest in invading them back. Denmark, says the historian Ole Fenger, started to become a partner in Europe only during a period of some stability after 1050. Fast forward to today, and the comparative picture is totally different. The late starters are now the most advanced, arguably the most civilized countries in Europe, or for that matter, anywhere. These peoples have risen from poverty to prosperity and taken their place at the top table among the world's peoples in wealth and standard of living, and they have thereto found a way of sharing that prosperity so that almost everyone is reasonably included. They have managed that double act better than anyone else. Now that's an improbable achievement. Most economists think of equality and economic efficiency as a trade-off in which fairness, however well-intentioned, comes at a cost of lost productivity in the economy. The Scandinavian experience stands as a dramatic disconfirmation of that dismal proposition. They have invested more than others in social protection and have at the same time been among the most successful of capitalist economies in productivity and growth. They are well known for the former, but what is not as recognized is that they have performed just as well in raw economic terms. What stands out is not their equality, which everyone knows about, but that they've been able to be effective in production while also being generous in sharing. Furthermore, their experiment has taught them that it works to be generous in prosperity. Sharing has come about by way of a strong state, their welfare state. And there's another source of disquiet among social thinkers, that strong states become overwhelming in a way that erodes liberty and civic virtue. But that prediction also has not materialized in the Scandinavian case. Their states are indeed forceful, again at the top league in effectiveness, but not at the cost of soft qualities. They are as robust in democratic quality as in technocratic governance. These people live in environments of protected liberty and make energetic use of their freedoms. Their cultures are of involved citizenship and social engagement. In all these matters, the Scandinavians are now leaders rather than laggards. So it adds up to people having it good in material terms, in the satisfaction of not living among others who are excluded, in being able to trust each other and the institutions of state and economy. Their equality is not a sacrifice, their state is not repressive, and they know it. Far from downtrodden in gloom, they are among the world's most relaxed and easygoing people. In international comparisons of contentment, even of happiness, they are again at the top of the lists. That journey, taking a European people from bottom to top, has seemed to be worth exploring. And I've done that in a recent book under the title The Story of Scandinavia, in which I follow the three brother-sister countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, over 1,200 years. I have obviously looked for regularities in that long trajectory, but I have found very few. There has been a tendency in Scandinavian historiography to see continuities, for example, from the free farmer of the Viking Age to the free citizen in today's democracy, or of consecutive groups of the downtrodden rising in demand of recognition in a continuous broadening of inclusion. I have rather found discontinuities. The Viking Age came to an age with little or nothing of lasting value to show for it. An agricultural upturn in the 1200s, driven by new technology, the iron plough importantly, made for a first period of surplus and an upturn in trade. That fell asunder in the Black Death, which wiped out half of the populations and left national economies paralyzed for 200 to 300 years. The next upturn enabled royal absolutism, which brought on 2+ centuries, which I call the age of perpetual warfare. The conscription of young men into armies and navies was of such proportion as to destroy local communities, stall population growth, and cause famines. Sweden, says the historian Nils Erik Billstrand, became a land of soldier widows. The disasters that afflicted Denmark during the 1650s led to a drop in population of 15% to 20%. Kings desperate for glory physically consumed their own economies and their most productive workforce. So if the Scandinavians are in a good place today, the road has not been smooth, to put it carefully. It has been, I have found, an awful history. The final upturn came only in the 20th century, and then by the Scandinavians being able to liberate themselves from their historical inheritance. If I praise today's Scandinavia, which I suppose I do not romanticize the trajectory. Rather than a history of continuity, then, I have found ruptures of ups and downs. But even in those ruptures, it has turned out not without regularities, not continuities, but regularities. And as I worked my way from century to century, it started to strike me that I again and again kept meeting a religious influence. Whether things were going well or badly, or peacefully or violently, religion was present, sometimes as an influence, sometimes as a force to be called on. I have come to think of that as an interesting discovery. We do not today, perhaps, give religion all that much thought. Our cultures, we think, are secular, rational, liberal. We make our own decisions. We do not follow dogma. Well, I'm not so sure. Historically, certainly, the religious factor has been inescapable. The ups and downs along the long road can be seen as trials and errors in state formation, up to today's welfare state. And it is conspicuous that governance, to use a contemporary term, has consistently played out in a symbiosis of secular and religious influences and of state and church interactions. That is true, I have found, not only in the distant past, but all the way up to our own times. Indeed, I will suggest that what might be seen as the ultra-secular modern Scandinavian welfare state sits on a foundation of religious tradition. The religious influence, then, may be lurking in our own world, more than we may wish to be aware of, and still doing its job. Its job for good and bad, it should be stressed, perhaps more often for the bad. So let me return to the beginning and work my way through to contemporary predicaments, while keeping an eye on the religious influence. I should just introduce a caveat before I review some of the evidence. There are two aspects to this religious factor. One is faith, the interaction of religious beliefs and other mindsets. And the other is church organization, the workings of faith-based structural power. We need to keep both in mind. For 200 or 300 years, early years, the Scandinavians made themselves felt in Europe. Indeed, throughout the known world, from Constantinople to the Americas, as raiders, traders, and settlers, as Vikings. They were not known as Vikings at the time. That brand only came into use centuries later as an instrument of national romanticism. In England, they were known as the Danes, even if they came from Norway or Sweden, or the heathens, or the violent ones, That last label stuck wherever they operated. It was for their ruthless violence that they were known. Deservedly so. They did not have much going for them in power. They were few. The total population of the three countries was in the order of 800 to 900,000 people. And the Vikings, those who ventured out, were but small subsamples of small populations. They did not have horses of much use, nor good arms. What little they had of iron was of poor quality, and they were not skilled in treating it. They were in part successful in conquest. They took the territory that became Normandy, for example, but only with the help of horses and weapons stolen or bought from the Franks themselves. What gave them success was superiority over others in brute and unrestrained violence. Even in violent times, they were the best of the violent ones. We can say that with certainty, because otherwise they could not have prevailed. Had it not been for their excellence in violence, there would have been no Vikings. Now, where did their willingness and ability to use violence come from? Well, it came firstly from necessity. They were out after capital. Kings and chiefs at home needed money to work with, and a good deal of it, but that they had none of their own, no silver and no gold to dig out of the ground. They were out for adventure and glory. They were out for captives to trade as slaves. They were out for territory to occupy and settle. What they needed, they had to take, and to get it, they had to overcome their weakness with superior violence. But there was also, and secondly, a positive willingness in the glorification of bloodthirsty ways. And that willingness came from their beliefs. They were pagans, and in their particular belief system, violence was honorable. It is perhaps a stretch to call their paganism a religion. It was without moral guidance or command, but it was a system of beliefs. They believed in many gods, and they believed that those gods had powers. The gods gave them license and imposed on them no inhibitions. We know that from their early ways. Churches and monasteries in Christian Europe were protected sanctuaries. There was general acceptance that they should have peace. They were sites of wealth in treasure and manuscripts, and mostly unguarded or not much guarded, since they did not need much protection. The Vikings respected no norms. Their early modus operandi was to attack and plunder monasteries in particular. And they did that massively in the German and French lands and across England and Ireland, getting away with silver, with manuscripts that were treasures, but for them nothing but means of ransom, and with captives for slavery. They were fearless because their beliefs told them that death was splendid, certainly death in battle. The fallen on the battlefield gained access to the homes of heroes in the afterlife, Valhalla, the chief god Odin's hall, and Sesrumnir, the hall of Freya, the goddess of womanhood and sex. There, life went on as it should, with fighting to death by day, for the fallen to rise again to feast by night. A culture finds the gods it needs, says the author, Kevin Crossley Holland. And the Norse world needed gods to justify the violence that was part of his hallmark. There are many necessities behind the Viking experience. They could not have been Vikings without the ships. They could not have been Vikings without the slaves. But also, there could not have been Vikings without their pagan beliefs. The notion of sin and guilt, it has been observed, came to the north only with Christianity. The pagan belief system did its necessary work for the Scandinavians, but could not last. Viking chiefs were impressed by what they saw in Christian Europe, by the wealth and splendor of the church and the respect that the faith commanded. By converting, they made themselves equals of allies and adversaries alike, and could deal with Europeans on an equal footing. And they could be accepted as members of what was understood to be civilized culture. Kings could not be European kings without being Christian, and when kings were Christian, chiefs could not be chiefs without following suit. The christening of Scandinavia was top-down, and the work of the Scandinavians themselves. Where commoners resisted, they were converted by the sword, as was the way in particular of King Olav Haraldsson of Norway, the later Saint Olav. By around the year 1000, Christianity was established in the sense that determined resistance had ended. Now, Christianity came with two big innovations: a new belief system and a church organization. The bearers of the new beliefs brought with them a gospel of faith, mercy, peace, the liberation of slaves, and help to the poor, all of which could not but seem remarkable to pagan minds. The old faith just folded. There are many reasons to explain why the Viking Age came to an end, one being that it could not continue under Christian norms. Now, paganism had no organization, perhaps some temples, but no churches and no priestly class. Kings brought Christianity from Europe physically by importing monks, priests, and bishops. The first Christian king of Norway, Håkon the Good, from around 935, was baptized in England and brought priests with him to the old country. Later kings followed suit. Their migrant officials needed institutions, hence the building of early churches and monasteries, eventually cathedrals. They came with the art of writing and started something brand new: schooling and education. They became indispensable by serving kings with secretariats, writing, recording, and archiving. They invented organized taxation, the tithe, in the process introducing yet another innovation, poor relief. A fourth of the tithe was for the poor. Viking kings had not really been kings. They were only the strongest chiefs and had no other legitimacy than the ability to prevent others from toppling them. Now kings started to find that they have more of a platform to stand on. They had around them an apparatus that gave them institutional support and legitimacy, and which could be mobilized for governance. They were getting to where Charlemagne had been 300 years earlier. In the decree of 789, for example, he, Charlemagne, established schools throughout his realm. That he could do because he could get churches and monasteries to do the job. Now, kingship was emerging also in the distant north, so that kings could not only be kings, but also govern. That became possible only thanks to the emergence of an organized church that could serve the king's administrative branch. We are in the very early stages of state formation, and it was thanks to the church and its organization alone that states were becoming a real possibility. In the transition from paganism to Christianity, faith had mattered strongly. The old faith was outcompeted, and the new one would, in the words of the historian Delisle Burns, by its establishment of a community of feeling and experience among all men, women, and children, take on a force of such strength that it is difficult to fathom for those of us who have lived for generations in the age of reason. Then, with Christian beliefs firmly established in people's mind, the religious influence could grow and spread through church organization. Now, if kings had thought that the church would remain content to be their instrument, they were soon proved wrong. The church that had given birth to state embryos soon made itself a state within the state. It was the holder of the governing capacity on which kings depended, and it used that grip to make itself powerful. National churches turned out to be branches of a universal church. There was no organization like it in Europe, with a center of command in Rome and a network of bishoprics, churches, and monasteries, and their affiliated institutions such as schools and colleges across the continent. Its custodianship of the shared language of Latin, and its monopoly on the mediation of truth. As land became valuable, the church made itself rich, filthy rich. By the 12th century, the Scandinavian churches were the owners of 40% of all arable land, and hence the recipients of the same proportion of land rent, in addition to its 10% of all earnings in the tithe, adding up to 10 times the income of the crowns. The ecclesiastical class comprised 1 in every 300 of the populations. This was not a force that fleeting kings with a few years on the throne could push around. Rather, the church became the pusher and the state the pushed. When Scandinavia was pulled into the embrace of the Church of Rome, the church was in the grips of Crusader mania. Most of European Christendom became involved. The First Crusade was followed by a Norwegian crusade. From 1107 to 1111, it was headed by King Sigurd, then about 20 years old, who became the first European monarch to go to Jerusalem. A contingent of about 5,000 men fought their way along the European west coast and through the Mediterranean, uniquely crusading by sea to reach Jerusalem in 1110. There he, Sigurd, assisted Baldwin of Jerusalem in laying siege to the coastal town of Sidon, successfully by the Nordic fleet barricading the town's sea routes. Job done. Sigurd and his men left for Constantinople and returned home, bringing back a splinter of the Two Cross for St. Olaf's burial site and, as Norse chiefs craved, repute and honor. Other Scandinavian kings were under pressure from the church to do likewise, but none did. Instead, they solved their problem of obedience by crusading in their own neighborhoods. Crusades swept across Europe itself in wars across the continent that were given dignity by being fought under the banner of the cross. Danish and Swedish kings marched east, Swedish ones into Finland and towards Russia, and Danish ones along the Baltic shores into today's Baltic states. Here was born, under church pressure, Scandinavian imperialism. Sweden rescued Finland from the Orthodox Church, and Denmark stamped out real or imagined remaining pockets of paganism. From here on in the next centuries, Sweden and Denmark did battle over Baltic territory, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes others, Russia in particular. Sweden rose to what Swedish historians still call the Age of Grandeur, until their North European empire collapsed by the force of Peter the Great at the end of the Great Northern War in 1721, and Finland was lost to Russia in 1809. These were not religious wars, but the fire of imperialism that fueled them and would fuel later expansionist adventure had been lit by church encouragement and ambition. As long as churches were strong, crowns were held in check. Church and crowns balanced power against each other. Now that was perhaps for the good of populations, considering what was to come once crowns were able to outmaneuver churches. the church in Rome got punch drunk on wealth and power and made itself obscene. That enabled the Reformation, a reform movement that got out of hand and became a revolution. The consequences in power relations were monumental. In 1517, a German monk and professor of biblical studies in the town of Wittenberg, Martin Luther, nailed a list of 95 theses on the church door, the gist of which was a denial of the church's claim that there was no salvation other than through priestly grace. In many of the German lands, and certainly in Scandinavia, it turned out that princes who had been held back by church counterpower were more than happy to grasp the opportunity to cut that church down to size. As you know well enough here in Prague, church reform had started earlier in the work of in particular Jan Hus, more than a century before Luther, and with the establishment in these lands of the first Reformed church. But only now had the rot in the Church of Rome become so ingrained that the time was ripe for revolution. That revolution took many directions: Calvinist, Protestant, even a counter-revolution within the established church. The version that was accepted in Scandinavia was distinctly Lutheran. As Christianity had come to Scandinavia in a royal top-down project, so also was the Scandinavian Reformation, the making of kings, and by them imposed on church and people. That was then done against some resistance, but as resistance to Christianity had folded quickly, so also did now Catholic resistance to the Lutheran Reformation. What unfolded was revolutionary on many fronts at the same time, in faith, in church organization, and in state power. We are around the year 1520, and events were moving quickly. In that year occurred the bloodbath of Stockholm. The three kingdoms were nominally in a union under the Danish crown, the Kalmar Union it was called. The union had in reality broken down, but a Danish king, Christian II, was in principle king also of Sweden and decided to claim the kingdom that was his. He did that in a military assault on Sweden, successfully. On Sunday, the 4th of November, he was crowned, and the feast went on for 3 days in the palace at Stockholm. Then on the Wednesday, the palace gates were shut, and the assembled Swedish grandees locked up. The feast became court. The charges were heresy and infringements of church rights. Christian was judge. Executions followed in Stockholm's central square. Bishops first, 2 of them, then nobles by order of eminence. 82 men at least lost their heads on that day, and more were killed in later purges. The atrocity was possible because Scandinavia was infected by religious turbulence. Christian shrugged it off as just one of those things and returned to Copenhagen to continue his kingship there. Lutheranism was taking hold, and Christian, who in Stockholm had said he was protecting the old church, edged up to the reformers. So did his successor, Frederick I. A Danish translation of the New Testament was issued in 1524, so that, as it says in the preface, no one needs be deceived by priests and monks. But matters were not settled, and on Frederick's death in 1533, Denmark collapsed into 3 years of civil war, partly on religious lines. The heir in line, Christian III, marched on Copenhagen with an army of mercenaries, laid the city to ruin, nationalized the church, and let himself be crowned in a Lutheran ceremony. And while he was at it, with the stroke of a pen in a royal decree, He abolished the Kingdom of Norway because, it was said, the country was so deprived of power and fortune that it was unable to maintain a lord and king of its own. Norway was reduced to a province of Denmark and so remained until 1814. In Sweden, the Reformation came with Gustav Vasa, king from 1523, mainly for the purpose of confiscating church property and wealth. When Denmark's Christian II returned to Copenhagen after the bloodbath in Stockholm, he left occupying forces behind. The Swedes had to fight them off, which they did under the leadership of the young Gustav. He was able to do that with Hanseatic, that is German, assistance in money and mercenaries, and was in massive debt to them. He freed himself from that dependency with the help of church wealth. He took no interest whatsoever in theological matters, but he had a keen sense of money and power. Now, Lutheranism contains a complicated combination of two or more, certainly two contradictory ideas, obedience and liberty. The imposition of obedience was mainly political. Luther's concern was for the clean church, devoted to matters of faith and salvation and free from earthly wealth and power. In his teaching, it was the business of kings and princes to rule, which they did by the grace of God, and therefore a duty on underlings to obey. No wonder Scandinavian kings liked what they heard. They were being told by high theological authority that royal dictatorship was God's will. The strain of liberty was infused into religious life. The Reformation helped lift the human spirit, says the historian Norman Davis, out of a church-sanctified psychological environment of fear. The new teaching brought God's nearness into ordinary people's lives. Under the old regime, salvation had been given or denied by the church and its men. Now, it was a matter directly between myself and my God, with the church only for guidance. That was liberation. Commoners as well liked what they heard. Their religious liberation came at a cost, the duty of obedience shifting to the state, but that was a cost worth paying. The state gained massively in strength. The Scandinavian Reformation was a controlled revolution. The church was handed over not to the people, but to the crown as a state church, and remained part of the apparatus of control during the period of royal absolutism. This brute regime of repression lasted 250 to 300 years until it broke down in the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars and their outreach to Scandinavia. But even in the escape from absolutism, important strands of the Reformation regime survived. First, the strong state itself. When the church was nationalized, the state took on vast additional responsibilities that had previously been church authority. That accumulation of responsibility has subsequently continued. What also survived was the norm set of obedience as a necessary condition for the steady accumulation of state responsibility. Both the strong state and the underlying pact of obedience remain part and parcel of the modern Scandinavian order that I have sketched in the introduction to this lecture. Both have their roots in the Reformation, in the Lutheran Reformation, it must be stressed. However, in the Lutheran contradictions, there was also, notwithstanding political dictatorship, a thrust of religious liberty in that worship was decentralized to the faithful themselves, a further Reformation influence that was to survive. When absolutism was lifted, the force of popular religiosity was there, ready to be released as part of a new enlightenment. It took the form of religious awakening that swept across the Scandinavian lands. The awakening unfolded in a battle with the controlling hand of the state church, but was unstoppable. Because it took battle, it became organized. Lay preachers held house meetings where they traveled and left behind groups and societies to continue their work. This was the beginning of a 19th century innovation of popular movements and organization, the innovation that would roll on into the making of modern democracy. The awakening flourished. The idea took hold that people could engage and participate. Causes presented themselves for which they could put their energies to work. In chronological order, the cause of faith and the true interpretation thereof, as of the early 19th century. The cause of mission, the spreading of the faith both domestically and into the wider world, as of mid-19th century. And the cause of temperance, the slaying of the demon drink, as of late 19th century. We are at the birth of civil engagement, associational life of many kinds, giving each other momentum. If, observes the historian Christian Witt, it was a matter of a godly gathering, a friendly society, a reading circle, or a political association, it was most often the same circle of men and women who were in the lead. The temperance movement was hugely consequential. Drink was of epic proportions, in consumption of alcohol 5 times that of today. It was the poor and the downtrodden who were the most afflicted. The organized fight against drink, much of it growing out of religious groups and societies, was of and for the common people. It was successful, and once established in organized form could metamorphose from early in the 20th century into what became working class organization. The working class vanguard emerged out of the popular movements that followed the religious awakening. The work of the men and women of that vanguard secured in the first instance, around 1920, the universal vote, and then enabled, in the next round, the use of voting power to create the social democratic movements that for 50 years became the dominant force in Scandinavian politics and governance. Hence, there is a direct line from the Reformation beliefs via popular organization and working class mobilization forth to modern democracy. Democracy is, of course, not the exclusive domain of Scandinavia, but the form it has taken in the Scandinavian brand of what my colleague Gösta Esping Andersen has called welfare state capitalism, around the strong state and the culture of obedience, has distinctly Lutheran characteristics. I have wanted to suggest that 1,200 years of a branch of European history can be told, if with many shortcuts and perhaps some leaps of imagination, as a religious history, a history of religious influence. That has been a revelation. I am myself very much of the secular mindset that is probably characteristic of contemporary liberal European culture, and it has been surprising me to discover the force of religious influence as it has unfolded over the centuries. Once having made that discovery, it seems almost frivolous to ask if this influence is still with us today, and if it remains an influence of strength. As we see it in the historical record, once we open our eyes to it, it is there to be seen today if we only look. Ask the Irish, both north and south. Ask the Russians about their Orthodox Church, or the Ukrainians about the same. Or ask the Spaniards about their Catholic Church, or the Americans about evangelism, or anyone in Latin America about the force of evangelical mission. Or ask the peoples of the Arab world, or Iran, about Islam and its various directions. And ask the people who are voting in today's India about the force of Hindu nationalism. Or ask the Chinese dictators about their fear of religious revival. Or ask the Scandinavians. There, the legacy of the Reformation continues to exercise a heavy influence on mindsets and habits. The Scandinavian mentality leans to the down-to-earth, the modest, the practical, the obedient, the serious, the dedicated, the hardworking, the equal, the frugal. You are not supposed to stand out or promote yourself. Community and collectivism are valued. It expresses itself in we terms rather than I terms. It is dour, heavy-duty laden, and short on fun-loving. It is not the brilliant that is celebrated, but the steady. We Scandinavians are preachers. We preach to ourselves and each other, and we preach to others. We preach to the world. We are missionary peoples, both in the narrow sense of Christian mission and in the broader sense of wanting to teach others and make the world better. We feel responsibility to do good and think of ourselves as able. If it weren't alien to the culture itself, we might think of ourselves as chosen people. This culture, as others, has many nuances and mixed and complicated origins and facets, but there is an undeniable streak of Lutheran stricture. It is a functional culture, conducive to order, efficiency, and trust. In the end, the people who live under its influence are probably lucky. It is not an attractive culture, conformist, puritanical, socially repressive, moralistic, but it is distinct. The Scandinavians are of their own kind and stand out as different in the European cultural landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting talk and very, let's say, I enjoyed it as a talk, as a particular way of presentation, which we usually recently don't have opportunity to hear in such a beautiful language and well-built up lecture. Thank you so much. You were talking about, well, continuities and discontinuities, but you came in the conclusion to the idea of Scandinavian distinctiveness, which is somehow rooted in its history and past experience. I wonder, in the world today, which is so much interconnected and constantly on the move, do you think that this particular Scandinavian tradition, Scandinavianism, can last, or will it change? Will it be somehow also on the move? Thank you.
Well, nothing lasts. Nothing lasts. And in one way that our interconnected world presents itself to the Scandinavians is through immigration. The Scandinavian countries have had a massive inflow of immigrants over the last half century or so. originally a European migration to the north for industrial economic reasons, in particular to Sweden, the most industrial of the countries. Subsequently also a huge immigration from beyond Europe of people of other ethnicities and faiths. So the Scandinavian countries have become very mixed populations, very much so. I mean, I think about 25% of the population of Oslo today are people who are of foreign birth or of parents of foreign birth. And it is the immigrant population that is fueling much of what is still a growth in the population. So that influence is very strong. Even so, even under that pressure, the character, as I read it, of the Scandinavian societies holds up pretty well. Now, many of my Scandinavian friends and colleagues would question this, but I say to them, you are too close to the reality to observe reliably. Listen to me instead, I am looking in from outside. One is because of the strong state. I mean, the Scandinavians have been able to absorb immigration pretty well. And they've done pretty well in inclusiveness. Pretty well. Not, you know, it's not without problems at all, but they have done pretty well. And they've been able to do that, I think, partly because of the apparatus of the state. I should say the monetarist apparatus of the state in this connection is local. Local government is very strong in the Scandinavian countries. So local responsibilities are very strong. And local people, local Norwegian people tend to feel, if they sometimes feel ambivalent about immigration, they generally feel very protective about their own immigrants, those in their own communities. So that meeting with the interconnected world has gone pretty well and has certainly not eroded the characteristic of the Scandinavian societies, although it's testing it, but it's held up pretty well. Another aspect of this is all the Scandinavian countries are officially entirely international, very strongly engaged in internationalism and in support of United Nations work on all levels and in all areas. And in particular, the Norwegians have been able to engage very heavily in this because they have recently become so rich and have a surplus of money, much of which is invested into good international work. So they are very active in such efforts as are underway in organizing and regulating the interconnectedness of the modern world. And they have a certain distinctiveness in that also. I mean, some of this goes back to the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, who defined an entirely distinct voice for international voice for Scandinavia, or at least for Sweden. And then much of it in the strong activism that these countries engage in today. So I think that although the world is changing very rapidly and that is affecting the Scandinavian countries, there is still something of enough strength there that it does not get rolled over by these current influences. In the book I didn't bring a copy of that. The Story of Scandinavia. This is the 1200 years history of Scandinavia. It ends with, I point to the culture of trust. I alluded to that here. It's very important, the culture of trust. And I say that outsiders who look in may think of the Scandinavian welfare state as a big system of redistribution, which it is, but the Scandinavians knows that it sticks deeper. It goes into an underlying culture of trust that enables this strong state. And I say that the Scandinavians may think that as long as we are able to preserve this culture of trust, we can handle whatever the world may throw at us. And I say they may be right.
Well, thank you very much, Stein. I was impressed by your presentation. By the same token, are there any other explanatory factors that contributed to this outcome that is really very surprising? You speak about Scandinavia, and one hypothesis might be is a part, not the main explanation, of course, but a part of the Scandinavian success that you spoke about several strong but small states in terms of democracy and in terms of values that are shared by, let's say, majority of several states that operate in Scandinavia. Thank you.
So the question is about the effect of smallness, is it? Well, I mean, in territory, they're not small. You know, the Scandinavian countries together are the size of Germany and France together. So in territory, they're certainly not small. The joint population is about 25 million or so now. It's not all that small. So, and I think sometimes when it is pointed out that these are small countries, what people really mean is that they are homogeneous. I mean, I'm not saying that's what, but there is something to that, some association there. You know, they've never really been homogeneous populations. They're certainly not now. Small, I don't know. I mean, if I make a comparison to the country in which I now live, and I've lived for a long time, to Britain, that is certainly a bigger country in population. It's smaller in area, but bigger in population. But the distinct difference that I would see there is not in size, but in the apparatus of government. And Britain, just to take that as an example, is a country that doesn't have local government. You know, there's virtually no local government in Britain. There are local authorities, but they're not government. In the Scandinavian case, local government plays a very important role. And the state is not that one state, but it manifests itself, as I was indicated, locally. I'm not sure why size as such should matter all that much. Yeah, I think I think I'll have to leave it with that.
That might bring this final Scandinavian success.
Oh, okay, they certainly have it easier than the very big countries. Okay? So there is. So I agree with you. There is.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. Let me ask you something. You speak a lot about strong state and obedient population, but perhaps I'm wrong, but I also noted once or twice you mentioned leaning towards autonomy in the culture of the people. Did I overheard it wrong, or is it another aspect?
There's certainly not a culture of obedience that means no non-involvement or non-discussion. I mean, civic life is vibrant. There's a civic engagement on all levels, locally, associational life, a very vibrant press. So it's not passively obedient. But there is, maybe this is also a comparison with where I now live, but there is at the end of the road a trust in the institutions of the state in particular, but also of the economy. That I think, certainly when I am able to compare as now an emigrated Scandinavian, which is quite distinct. In Britain again, there is an instinct of distrust. I mean, that's in one way that's very valuable. That's a characteristic of British, the British liberal tradition. So this culture of obedience, it's, as I think I said in the ending, it's not pretty. It's not straightforward either. But I think I said also, I think that the people who live under its influence are in the end lucky, although it's not an entirely pretty picture. But it's not sort of passive obedience. But let's put it this way. There's a pretty good ability to have a robust discussion and then to bring that discussion to an end and then come to some kind of consensus about things and then move on. So, and that comes from trust that, those who are engaged in the discussion, they don't disbelieve the decency of others. They accept it, they engage in the discussion and understand that things have to move on. Maybe there is a tendency of that kind.
Thank you for a very nice talk. I have a question. You went through all the history, and there was a point where you mentioned this Christian expansion of Danes and Swedish people to the east. And I remember that they had a big role in founding the Kiev Rus, or I think Vikings were actually the kings of Kiev Rus. Can you be more specific on this detail? Is that correct, actually? Thank you.
Yes, it's correct, but it's a big question these days. And if Mr. Vladimir Putin was here, he would have had something to say about it. So let's there. The one Viking route was towards the east, down eventually to the Dnieper and to Constantinople, and another route down the Volga to the Caspian Sea and on to Baghdad, all the way. The most important of those routes were the ones down the Dnieper, and Kiev was then being established as an important trading center with an influx of people from the south and from the north, the Norsemen, in other words. And there was a Norse inflow there that was part of the creation of that center of Kiev. So it grew partly out of a Norse influence and Norse influx. Not exclusively, but partly. So we can say that there was a Norse contribution to the creation of the Kiev, that then became the Kievan Rus. Rus the name is probably derived from men who row, who are capable of rowing. It's also believed that it could be derived from men of red hair, or men of the Roslagen area, that is an area in Sweden, whatever. There is a connection there to the north. So I think it's correct to say that the center that became Kiev grew partly by the force of this incursion from the north, both of people and of influences. And that center, the trading center of Kiev, grew to becoming the Kievian Rus. And that center of political gravity then somehow, which is not clear, sort of drifted a bit north and east to become the Duchy of Muscovy, eventually Moscow, and eventually Russia, and so on. So there is an influence there which lives today, which has its origins in the Viking experience in the north.
Whether the king was the founder, the first king was Viking or not? No.
We are now getting into very mythological areas, so it's not known. It's not known.
Okay, thank you.
There is one story that there was at least an early Viking king who was the chief in Kiev. But this is not things we know. And that history is up for anyone's grab. And here I think this is currently, big political history. So we are served with being very careful about what we say of certainty about these matters. It's certain that there was an influence from the north, but exactly what form that influence took is not certain. And it's not something that I, at least, would want to pronounce on with any certainty.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for your lecture, for your very illuminating presentation of the Scandinavian distinctiveness in this broad historical background. I would like to ask about the role of plurality and homogeneity in the ideological world, or in Europe, in many European countries, the roots of democracy are often discussed as fruit of plurality, of many competing ideologies, of the also religious wars, and the countries which are more homogeneous in their traditions are often presented as more tending to, absolutism, or at least having some less democratic structure. Especially, for instance, when one thinks on the traditions in Spain, Italy, or other countries who are not so pluralistic ones. What is the distinctiveness of Scandinavia that such a Lutheran country, rooted in Lutheran traditions and theology, has such a sense for plurality and internal dialogue?
Well, the Scandinavian countries have never really been homogeneous. They have been mixed populations. Sweden and Norway have had and still have a sizable Sami population. There's a big Finnish minority, for example, in Sweden, which is a recognized population group. There is the German minority in Denmark. And there are other minorities that live and have lived in the Scandinavian countries, Jewish, Catholic, and so on. So the homogeneity of these societies, I think, should not be sort of overestimated, and they're certainly not homogeneous now. I don't think that's what you were doing, but anyway, I think it's worth mentioning. Now, What is it that makes, if I understand your question right, the question is, what is it that makes these countries or cultures engaged in alleviating conflicts in the world between competing faiths and competing belief groups? I don't, if that was the nature of the nature of your question. And I don't know. I mean, it hasn't been a historical characteristic. Historical characteristic was that these were missionary peoples, and still, mission is still a very strong thing in the Scandinavian countries. Go out into the world and convert the non-believers. It's a very strong tradition, a surviving tradition. It's very strong. And I think maybe the reputation that you were indicating to is maybe more state-driven than population-driven. It's part of the engagement of states that have become determined that they should preserve for themselves an image in the world as international, as peacemakers, as contributors to development. I'm really just speculating here, actually. I think this is more state-driven than population-driven. I don't think the Scandinavians as a people are particularly tolerant, but there is a very distinct state activity in being good citizens in a complicated world. That, I think, comes more out of the strong state tradition than any inherent tolerance in the culture. I'm a little bit at loss in answering your question, so this is more speculation than really an answer.
If you could, would you still, or would you like to live in Norway in the future?
Well, I don't, so I think I can't say that. But I visit often. But it is still a good question, actually. Once you put it to me as a personal question, it's a good question. Because around 1990, I did make myself an immigrant from Scandinavia. I did leave. And it was a choice. I mean, I had a very good opportunity to remain in several ways in Scandinavia. But I did decide to leave. And in the book I mentioned, The History of Scandinavia, I do mention my own situation slightly. And leaving Scandinavia, to some degree, came out of the experience of living for 3 years in Sweden. Now, that's a delicate thing for a Scandinavian to say, because those of you who are familiar with the Scandinavian setting knows that although I'm speaking of the Scandinavians, they are very different, and they are not always very friendly towards each other, to put it carefully. So this is a touchy thing for me to say. But, you know, this culture, which I said is the people who live under its influence are probably lucky. It is not an attractive culture. And I'm very aware of that personally. So maybe that's enough for an indication of comments to your, thank you for your question.
I would like to thank you a lot for your very thought-provoking lecture. I'm a Scandinavianist myself here in Prague. Cela dansk. Tusen tak. It was interesting, and of course I have so many thoughts, but I'd like to ask you one thing, because you just pointed out that maybe the social pressure, which undeniably is present in Scandinavian countries, is connected to the Protestantism, to the religious control and the Protestantism adopted in the 16th century. And maybe some of you read the very famous novel by Axel Sandemose, who is partly Danish, partly Norwegian. It's in Czech called Uprchlík kříží svou stopu, in Flüchtling krysse sitt spår. It's a book about the social pressure in Scandinavia that is felt as a horrible thing. And when referring to Scandinavia in this country, we are considering Scandinavian countries as role models during the COVID crisis and in other occasions and situations. But very often you hear this, but it's too much social pressure. If you look up the dictionary, the Czech dictionary, saying something about egalitarianism, the only collocation is negative. If you look up the Danish or Norwegian dictionary and find the word egalitarianism, then it's only positive because it means equality between people that is desirable and we should strive towards. So my question to you is, do you consider, as far as I understood your lecture, the social pressure is something positive, actually, because it's adopted, internalized by the Scandinavian population, and it's done deliberately, on their own choice. Of course, it was imposed upon the Czechs in an indirect way, and it was forced upon us, which is a very different situation, but we consider Scandinavian countries in this very respect as a scary role model. And I think I'm a very big fan of a strong state. So I like the Danish obedience, the Norwegian obedience, the Swedish obedience. The question to you is, do you see some negative sides of that?
Well, I think the summary I gave in the last of Scandinavian mentality is very close to a Sandemose description.
Maybe just one, because Sandemose, if you haven't read it, he has a decalogue, which is like the Christian decalogue, but it's reformulated. And it's all about, you should not believe you are more than the others. You should not believe that you mean more than the others. You must not, you are part of the society, and you must be equally tall and mighty as all the others. You must not be more than the others. And it's 10 commandments. Sorry for that explanation.
So I think that the people who live under the influence of this culture, I think they are lucky. But it's not pretty. It's not pretty. It is, how did I describe it? It's not an attractive culture. It's conformist, puritanical, socially repressive, and moralistic. It is that. But there is underlying, there is a sort of cohesion, which is very fortunate. It's not without cost, but it's very fortunate. But the question there again about, you're putting the question to me, and you put it to me personally. I have left it. I've gone elsewhere. Now, that has to do with that, as other facts in social observation, has many causes, but it's part of it. So it's for me it's balanced. It's not attractive, but it's lucky.
I thank you very much.
Thank you very much again for your very interesting and nice lecture, really. I would like to come back to the role of religion in constituting the modern democracy or modern society. Because I believed that it is not just a motivation to be a brave, loyal citizen, but religion can also be a force of a revolt or a force of dissent or something like this. So my question is, do you have anything similar in the history of this paradisiac society you have presented us? And if not, my second question, what kind of spirituality it brought, in fact? What kind of religion it produced, in fact? Thank you.
Well, the religious revival, which I mentioned, as of the early 19th century, when the grip of absolutism lifted, and it was possible to express sentiments from below. That religious revival was a revival of rebellion and of dissent against the monotony of the state church and the power of the state church. So it was a movement of demand on the part of the people themselves that they should be in control of their own worship. It expressed itself in free religious movements and groupings where the idea was that the congregation itself should rule. It expressed itself in uneducated people being given positions of responsibility, even women being given positions of responsibility at the time. So this was an uprising, a rebellion against the prevailing order. And the kind of worship that was then cultivated, the kind of spirituality that was then cultivated was personal, void of symbols, void of churches, and in the hands of the people of the congregation themselves, to engage in themselves, in house meetings more than in churches, and so on. So the religious awakening was certainly a movement of dissent from below. It was heavily repressed in the beginning, but that repression didn't work. It continued, it survived, it broke through. So if that is maybe that is partly a comment or an answer to your question. Now, if we move up to today, it's different, isn't it? The religious life in Scandinavian communities is not strong, I think is right to say. It's not strong in the church, it's not strong outside of the church. And there are, except for some relatively narrow pockets, not much trace left of popular religious revival. There is some, but not much. So, although I think there is a religious influence there, it doesn't express itself very strongly in contemporary social life, at least as I read it. I don't know if this was directly to your question or if you would like to come again.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, if not, again, many thanks to Stein for his lecture, and many thanks to all of you for your questions and comments for the fruitful discussion. Thank you so much.